Last week we began the book of Exodus, and we're going to continue in the book of Exodus today. Exodus is where God comes back to his people. His people are still in Egypt, but they have now transformed from a single family to a large group of people. But just because they're a large group of people doesn't necessarily mean that they are a nation. Think about I don't know, any ethnic group that is within a country or several countries, but that aren't actually a nation. In fact, prior to 1948, you could think of the Jewish people again. Even in New Testament times, they're scattered throughout the earth. They still maintain their identity as Jewish people, but until 1948, they had no nation to call their own. They're just kind of an amorphous, loosely knit group of people spread out over a large area. And even though they identified as Jewish people, they had no actual home, they had no government, they had no structure. They're just a group of people. And that's kind of what the Israelites were like in Egypt at the end of this 40 years. They existed in Egypt. They were a slave group of people under the dictatorship of the Pharaoh, but they had no individual nationality status. They were identified as Israelites because the Egyptians hated them and they forced them into labor, but they didn't have that identity. And so they were a large group of people. They were out of the land. They had no national leader that God had promised. And Exodus is where God comes back to his people, and he starts to fulfill those promises in a grand way. And so he calls Moses, his chosen leader, out. And Moses runs away from Egypt, but God calls him there and sends him back to Egypt. And he begins to confront Pharaoh. And that's where we ended last week at the end of chapter 5. And in the beginning of chapter 6, if you're following along. God gave Moses a few signs to show the people. Remember the leprosy thing and the snake thing and the water to blood thing. And he impressed the leaders of the Israelite people, but he went to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, absolutely not, I'm not going to let you go. You're just a lazy bunch of people. You want to get out of doing your work. I'm not going to let you go for 3 days. You get back to work. In fact, now you have to work even harder. You have to make all the same number of bricks, but we're not going to give you the materials that we did before to make them. You have to scrounge up the materials, the straw, on your off hours, and then during the day you have to make the same amount of bricks. And the people were furious. And so it started out as a very cooperative effort between Moses and the people and God leading them. Now it's starting to deteriorate and sour a little bit, and that's the roadblocks that you see up there on the screen today. God's great plan seems to be hitting some roadblocks, because when Moses came back, the Israelites were on board. They said, yes, we see your signs. We believe that God has visited you. Go talk to Pharaoh, and we'll all get out of here. And Moses is excited, and they all go in. But Pharaoh shoots them down, and pretty soon, not only is Pharaoh against them, but you remember what we said towards the end of chapter 5, verse 15. The foreman of the people of Israel came and cried to Pharaoh, why are you treating us like this? No straw is given us, but you're beating your people. And they go back and forth. Verse 20, they met with Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them as they came out from Pharaoh, and they said to them, the Lord look on you and judge you, because you made us a stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and you put a sword in their hand to kill us. You haven't rescued us. Now things are worse than before you got here. Get out of here. You're not the kind of rescuer that we want. You've only made things worse for us. And the people kind of bail out on the plan. They say, we don't want to be rescued. If this is your idea of rescue, we don't want to be rescued. You've only made life harder for us. Well, they aren't the only ones that are discouraged, because in verse 22, Moses himself turns to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you done this evil to the people? Why did you ever even send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. Moses is not even on board anymore. And so when we started out with everybody excited about leaving Egypt, the Israelites themselves have bailed out. Moses has bailed out. Pharaoh's definitely not on board with this. The only person now who's still excited about freeing the Israelite people is who? The only one who's excited about this still is God himself. You remember the story in the book of Judges, the story of Gideon, remember? And they have to fight the Midianites, and Gideon says, great, I'll call out a great army. So he rounds up like 30,000 people, warriors. And God looks down and says, all right, this is great, but there's one problem. We have too many people. Your army's a little too big. It's probably about the only time in military history where somebody says, I think my army is a little too big. I need to whittle it down a little bit. But that's what God says. And so he has Gideon do a couple different things. And by the time everything is done, their army is down to, I believe, like 3,000 people. Little bits of nothing. No, 300 people. Sorry, I was off by 0. 300 people. Not nearly enough to fight anybody, let alone, the great Midian army. And you look at the story and think, God, what are you doing? What's going on here? Well, clearly he says, if a grand army from Israel goes and fights Midian, who gets the glory? Well, it's the grand army from Israel. If a little band of nobodies from Israel of 300 people goes and they defeat the Midian army with my help, it's going to be obvious how that happens because I was there to help them. I won the battle for them. I think that's kind of, excuse me, what's going on here in the end of Exodus 5. God starts out with all the people and Moses and everybody on board, but he whittles them down a little bit so that by the end of chapter 5, the only person who's rooting for Israel is God himself. If Israel's to be saved, there is nobody to give credit to except for God, because even Moses, the great deliverer, is not on board. But that's when we get to chapter 6. In chapter 6, we see the statement that I believe is kind of the turning point here. Chapter 6, verse 1, "But the Lord said to Moses, Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh." Israelites are not in favor. They're not on my team. Moses himself is pretty wishy-washy. He's on the fence. Now you'll see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of the land. And now everybody's ready to go. But then we get to verse 2 and 3, and here's what I want to read and think about for just a minute. God spoke to Moses, and he said to him, "I am the Lord." Now you notice the end of that verse, Lord, all capital letters. We've been over this enough times, I think everybody knows that when you see all capital letters, capital O, L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that means Jehovah, Yahweh, God's personal name, the one that he brought to Moses in the burning bush. When the people ask who it is, say, "I am the Lord, Yahweh, Jehovah." That's the name. So verse 2, God spoke to Moses and said, "I am the Lord, the all-knowing, the all-powerful, self-existent one who makes promises and keeps his covenant with his people. I am that God." Verse 3, "I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, as the El Shaddai. But by my name, the Lord, Jehovah, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them." When I talked to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he says, they knew me as the all-powerful, almighty El Shaddai. But they didn't know me as the Lord, as Yahweh Jehovah. He said, "I'm giving myself to you under a different name." And I think, wait a minute. And I turn back a couple chapters and I see this verse. In Genesis chapter 14, verse 22, he says, "And Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand to" who? The Lord, all capitals. This is a quote from Abraham to the king of Sodom where he used this very name. And what about this one? Just a chapter later in chapter 15, verse 2. "But Abram said, O sovereign Lord." There it is again. And what about this one later on in the chapter? "And he," talking about God, "said unto him," referring to Abraham, "I am the Lord that brought thee out of the Ur of the Chaldees and will give thee this land to inherit it. And he," Abraham, "said, Lord God," which again in the actual Hebrew was Yahweh, Jehovah, "whereby shall I know that I will inherit it?" So here's three references, easy, right off the top of our head, where clearly Abraham knew God by that name. So what happens in Exodus when God said, "Abraham didn't know me by this name, but you do"? Because clearly Abraham knew him by that name. What's going on? Did God forget? Did he make a mistake? Did Moses write something down wrong? No. What could it be? Oh, I have a hand. Yes, sir.
The word "know" means more than just intellectual knowledge.
Okay. Yes, exactly. You're on the right track. You want to elaborate any more, or want me to do it? Okay, he said, go ahead, you do it. Okay. Yes, that's exactly true. What have we said all the way through the book of Genesis? God has made these promises to Abraham, but Abraham never saw the fulfillment of that. He never saw fulfillment. He saw God's power and his direction and stuff like that in his life, and it's the same with Isaac and with Jacob, how he took care of the family and he protected them and he blessed them and all those things. But in the book of Genesis, God never kept any of his promises to that family, did he? He promised them over and over, but he never kept them. But here in the book of Exodus, God comes in chapter 6 and he said, before you've never really seen my character, and again, I think it's more than just the name, but it's the character behind it, as the covenant-keeping, promise-keeping, fulfilling God. Abraham never saw that side of me. I promised and promised, but during Abraham and Isaac and Jacob's lifetime, these promises never were fulfilled. You, however, will get to see that side of me because I am ready to fulfill my covenant to you, and I will keep this covenant to you. So even though they knew the name, and they could use the name, as you see here in Genesis, they never got to experience, as he said, that side of God's promise-keeping character. But now it's time for him to start keeping these promises. Again, this is what we said. We see the promises listed out there. So Abraham and Isaac did not know him as Yahweh because he didn't yet keep his promises to them. Only now, in the time of Moses, was the all-powerful, promise-keeping God going to fulfill some of those promises. And God says, all right, strap in, Moses, Israelites, everyone, it's showtime. And I love it when God comes to the point in Scripture when he says it's showtime. Oh, that's exciting. He says it's showtime to the Israelites here. When he sends his Messiah, he kind of says it's showtime. Someday he's going to come back to earth. He'll call us up there, and God will say, all right, after millennia, after 2,000 years of apparent silence from me, of course we know he's still in charge, all that stuff, but a visible silence from me, it's going to be showtime again. And he's going to bring judgment to the earth. He's going to punish wickedness. He's going to set things right. He's going to set up his reign. And once again, it will be showtime for God. Someday that will happen, and I'm excited about it. But this is one of those times where God says, it's time to show everybody who I am. Verse 4 of chapter 6. After he says, I will make myself known to you by this name. Verse 4, I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians have held as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery from them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgments. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you for possession. I am the Lord. I kind of emphasize a certain word throughout that whole passage, but I think you can kind of get the idea. What's the focus here? What is God saying? It is, in a sense, it is all about me, God says. You are just the people I've chosen. It is my power. It's my decision. This is my show. I will show you who I am. I'm going to show them who I am. I'm going to show the whole world who I am because of what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. You guys just put on your seatbelts because it's going to be a crazy ride. Buckle in, boys. Here we go. That's what God says. But I will do it. Verse 9, Moses thus spoke to the people of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and their harsh slavery, which is exactly how God set it up to be. Verse 10, so the Lord said to Moses, go and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the people of Israel go out of this land. And Moses said to the Lord, behold, the people of Israel have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me? For I am of uncircumcised lips. Again, even Moses is not confident in what's going to happen. But the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them a charge about the people of Israel and about Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to bring the people out of Israel and out of the land of Egypt. God says, this is what I've chosen you to do. You do it. You do what I tell you to do. I will take care of the rest because this is my show, and I'm going to show everyone who I am. Well, the next several chapters, chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, are all about the 10 plagues. We're not going to go into those in detail. I think you know them well enough. I did put a chart together about them if you really want to look at them. At least the first 9 I've charted out. The 10th I've saved off because we're going to talk about that one a little bit more. The blood, the frogs, the gnats, the flies, the dead livestock, the boils, the hail, the locusts, the darkness. All of these, I'm told from people who are smarter than myself, are kind of poking fun at the various Egyptian deities. You got the sun god for the darkness. You got the Nile, which they worshipped, to blood. You got the frogs, all the different things that they worshipped throughout the land of Egypt. And one by one, God is kind of poking his finger at the chest of each one of those gods, saying, I'm better than you, I'm better than you, I'm better than you, I'm better than you. And with each plague that comes along, God says that he is in that domain and not the Egyptian gods. A couple other things I've listed up here. You notice the first 1, 4, and 7, the top row there. God gives Pharaoh a warning in the morning that the next plague is coming. 2, 5, and 8, God gives a warning, but he doesn't say what time of day. And 3, 6, and 9, there appears, at least in the biblical narrative, to be no warning. God just does it. What's the significance of this? I have no idea. I don't have a clue. If anybody here has a good insight on what, if anything, that means, or if we're supposed to see anything in that pattern, please let me know, because that's been a curiosity to me for years and years and years now. I have no clue what that means, if we're supposed to see anything from that. But it sure charts out well on, nice on a chart, doesn't it? Other than that, I don't know what to say. We see that some of these were shared. Both Israel and Egypt were plagued by some of these, but some of them, they were not in Israel, and those are listed off right there as well. Again, I think God did some of that to demonstrate that he knows the difference and can differentiate between the Egyptians and his people. These are my people, Egyptians are not my people. Here's how I treat my people, here's how I treat not my people. And there's a difference. Why did he include some of them on the Israelites? Again, I'm not exactly sure. If anybody has some great insights on that as well, please let me know after the lesson sometime, because I'd like to hear about that. But many of these were not in Israel. Wouldn't that be fascinating to be in Egypt at this time? Wouldn't that be amazing just to see the massive amounts of frogs or gnats or hailstones coming down that God just plagued and decimated Egypt with at this time? Strongest nation on earth in that day, and God just destroyed it within a matter of probably a couple weeks. Probably took them from superpower status down to abject poverty and destruction. The amount of devastation he brought on this land single-handedly is just unbelievable. And how God separated out the Israelites from the Egyptians, and you wonder what's going through the Egyptians' minds as they're suffering and they're being overrun by the pests or the boils or the hailstones, and they look into the land of Goshen and see it's perfectly fine. They watch the weather report coming. Large hailstones coming today on all of Egypt. Oh, looks like we have a small pocket right over the land of Goshen. Who will not be receiving this? It will be clear, sunny, and 75 degrees in the land of Goshen. But everywhere else, you're going to receive devastating hailstones that will destroy all of your crops, trees, and anybody who's outside. Or the lightness in the dark. How did that work? All of Egypt was so dark, it says you couldn't even recognize anybody. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So dark that it could be felt, the Bible says. And yet in the land of the Israelites, in the land of Goshen there where they were living, it was light. So how does that work? How does God do that? Do you walk through a wall of darkness and all of a sudden you accidentally step over the boundary into Goshen, boop, and then now it's light, and you look back into the dark and it's light, and you kind of stick your hand into the dark and you can't see it, and you pull back out and now it's light? I don't know. Fascinating stuff. I would love to have been there. But God is absolutely demonstrating his power to his people and to the and to the Egyptians throughout these plagues. Well, these are only the first 9 plagues. We know that there is a grand finale with number 10, the death of the firstborn. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this one. In chapter 11, God kind of announces what the last one is. He says, with this last one, Pharaoh will finally kick you out of Egypt. They will kick you out. They'll be so afraid of you. What you're supposed to do, and he'd instruct them earlier, he specifically mentioned even the women, which I think was another insult to the Egyptian people. These ragtag bunch of slaves are going to plunder the land of Egypt, not by their strong military men, but by the wives and the little girls who are supposed to go next door to all their neighbors and say, excuse me, we're going to leave your land now. We're not going to be your slaves anymore. Will you please give us all of your gold and your jewelry? And they say, yeah, whatever you want. And they run to the back and they start pouring all their jewelry boxes into the little hats and the blankets of the little girls who are standing in front. Please take it. Just go. We can't tolerate any more of this stuff. Nobody's going to be left to the Egyptians if you don't get out of here. We will give you whatever you want. Just go. A panic scene almost. We see Pharaoh's advisors saying the same thing. He said, don't you realize that there's nothing left of this land? Get the Israelites out of here. We will all be destroyed. Chapter 11, as I said, was the 10th plague. Verse 4. So Moses said, thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who's behind the handmill, and the firstborn of all the cattle. Nobody says God isn't thorough, huh? Even the firstborn of all the livestock are going to die. Verse 6, there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, neither man nor beast, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. God says, I'm going to provide a way out for Israel, my people, so that anybody that looks at this plague can say, yes, God knows the difference between his people and the Egyptians, and here's how he treats his people, and here's how he treats his enemies. And everybody will know the difference. And so Moses brings the plan to the people. In chapter 12, verse 5, he says, here's what you do. Actually, let's back it up to verse 3. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household's too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take, can share one. Verse 5, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year-old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Verse 7, then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it, along the sides and along the top. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. And it goes on to continue, don't eat it raw or boiled and roast it, do all the different things. But God says, here's how you avoid the plague. If you do this, you will be safe. If you do not do this, your firstborn will die, just like all the other Egyptians. It says, pick a lamb or a goat out of your flock, 1-year-old, male, perfect condition. In the evening on such and such day, you are to kill it. You are to roast the meat, but you're to take some of the blood and put it on top and sides of the doors, and then you're to go into the house and have this meal. And if you do this thing, and if you stay inside in that house, I will pass over you, and my angel of death will not destroy your firstborn. And I've heard people look at this and they draw the picture in their mind, and here's the door, and they say, put it on the sides and on the top. And the angel will see it and not destroy, not bring death to your house. And people say, aha, I see the picture here. Don't you see the picture? The 2 sides and the top, and you connect the dots, and you see a beautiful picture of the cross that is to come. But I'm not exactly sure. I think that's on the right track, but I'm not sure that's exactly the picture they were to understand. For a couple reasons. One, to the best of my knowledge, from what I can tell in reading, in the time of the Egyptians and the Israelites, crucifixion had not yet been invented, and it wouldn't be for several centuries after that. So a picture of the crucifix wouldn't really be meaningful to them because they didn't know what crucifixion was. Second of all, putting myself in the place of the Israelites at this time. If God says, what you need to do is put some blood on the sides and the top of the door, and that's the only thing that will keep my messenger of death from destroying your family, I'm probably not going to take a cute, adorable little paintbrush and put a little dot on the side and the top of the door. What am I going to do? If this is the only thing that's saving my firstborn, and in fact, I myself am a firstborn, so I've got some, I've got some motivation here. I've got to make sure the angel sees this blood. This will not be a dainty paint job, okay? I'm going to take as much blood as I can. I'm going to coat the sides of the door and along the top. There's going to be so many coats of blood paint on this door, it's going to be dripping off. I'm going to put a little poster sign above the door that says, Dear angel, here is the blood. Please don't miss it. This is the only thing saving my life, is following these instructions. There's no way this angel is going to miss my blood. Probably, if I had to guess, it looked more like this. You know what I'm saying? But I don't think that destroys the picture at all, does it? Because they're killing this lamb at twilight, and they have to take the blood and they have to paint it around the door. And as I pass through the blood into the house, I know that's what's saving my life and the life of my oldest. And the only thing that stands between me and death is passing through that blood and into the sanctuary that lies beyond. And as I'm slitting that lamb's throat and it's laying there on the altar and it's bleeding out and it's suffering, and I see that blood coming out and I have to collect it, the value of that blood is immense to me because that's what saves my life. And as I walk up and I start to paint the door, the thought going through my mind is what? If the lamb dies, then I live. And that's the only thing saving my life. And I think that's a pretty powerful message that they would have absolutely understood. Yeah. Well, if they do that thing, they paint the doorposts. Same chapter, verse 12, he says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute my judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And no plague will befall or destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. When I see that blood, if you have passed through the blood and sought shelter and safety behind the blood that I have provided for you from my chosen lamb, then you will be saved." And again, I don't think I need to explain to anybody here the symbolism that's going on and the mindset that God is teaching here of how salvation comes through the blood and the faith that comes through the blood and passing through it and seeking that security. Sure enough, God is true to his word, is he not? Chapter 12, verse 29. "At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all of his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. And he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, 'Up, go out from my people, both you and the people of Israel. Go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks, take your herds, as you have said. Be gone, and bless me also. Get out of here. I cannot take any more. You have to leave now.' In a fit of rage, he says, 'Just leave. Just go. Just leave us alone.' And sure enough, verse 33, the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste. They said, 'We shall all be dead.' So the people took their dough and their stuff like he prescribed. The people of Israel journeyed from city to city, about 600,000 men on foot, besides all the women and children." Again, 600 men on foot. Just do a little math here. For every man, you assume there's a woman, so that puts us up to 1.2 million. Add in all the children, say 2 per family, be conservative. That puts you at over 2 million people. 2 million people waltzing out of Egypt, thanks to God's devastation of the land. And as they look around Egypt, as they walk out, and they look at all the things that used to be such a superpower and an oppressive force over them, and now it's just laying in ruins as they waltz out free, nobody stopping them. We see in chapter 12, verse 40, it says, "The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." And it reminds us of a verse that we read weeks and weeks ago, doesn't it? From Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, where he said unto Abraham, centuries before, said, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. And just like God said, right down to the last detail, that's exactly what happened. They were in a foreign land, they were afflicted by the Egyptians, and when their time was up, God says, "All right, it's time to keep my promise to my people, and I'm going to take them out of the land of Egypt." And that's what they did. Also in chapter 13, verse 19, we see some stuff going on here. The pillar of cloud and fire is leading them. In verse 19 of chapter 13, "Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, 'Surely God will visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here.'" Again, it reminds us of Genesis chapter 50, how we close the book of Genesis. Do you remember this? When Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." Again, right down to the very last detail of where Joseph's bones, these 400-year-old coffin, and somebody thinks, in the midst of all this chaos and confusion and panic and violence and devastation and suffering, somebody has the presence of mind to say, "Hey, wait a minute. 400 years ago, we made a promise to Joseph that we would grab his coffin as we go out of here. Well, we're headed out of here. So somebody go, crack open the tomb, grab the coffin, and here we go." And sure enough, just like they had promised, Joseph's bones go along with this massive group of people out of the land of Egypt. And I think that's super impressive how God just keeps everything that he promises right down to the last detail. Well, what the plagues had said about God's superiority to Egypt's gods, the Red Sea says about God's superiority to Egypt's army. Again, an impressive, terrifying force, the Egyptian army. But in chapter 14, God says, all right, I'm done insulting your gods. Now I'm going to devastate you so that you are completely impotent at this point to do any more harm. Chapter 14, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of whatever that place is, between Midgal and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. And you shall encamp facing it by the sea. So they're kind of out walking around. God says, all right, do a little loop-de-loop here. Head back to the sea. I've got a special plan that I want you to be in on. And I'm guessing the Pharaoh probably had the spies out or something, and they come back and say, hey, Pharaoh, they're lost. They're wandering around. They don't know what to do. Verse 3, for Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness will shut them in. These stupid slaves don't know what they're doing. Verse 4, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all of his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, as if they didn't already. And they did so. So they go back and they camp right by the sea, kind of hemmed in a little area there by the mountains, and Pharaoh says, it's time to go get these people. Now they've learned their lesson that they cannot survive on their own without me, says Pharaoh. They need me in their lives. They need to be slaves. That's all they'll ever be, just stupid brick-making slaves. And I'm going to go round them up. I'm going to bring them back. They'll be thanking me for saving them from their own stupidity. And I will bring them back and enslave them again for myself. Verse 10, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And they feared greatly, and the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done in bringing us out to Egypt? Again, note the mentality of the Israelites here. Who is saving Israel? It's not like the Egyptians looked up and said, aha, God is with us. We will fight and defend ourselves. They're just cowering little people. They are completely helpless. God says, fine. That's the way I like it, because this is how I will get glory for myself in the eyes of the Egyptians, in the eyes of the world. Verse 12. Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. We didn't want you to save us in the first place, Moses. We told you not to, and now here we are. Pharaoh's attacking us. We're trapped. We don't know what to do. Verse 13. Moses said to the people, fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians who you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Your job, people, is to sit there and do nothing. Can you handle that? Are you up for the challenge to sit there and do nothing while God saves you? Okay, I guess so. Verse 26, skipping on down. The passage here, it talks to us about how Moses stretches his hand over the sea. God says, pick up your staff and hold it over the sea. And I'm not even sure if Moses knew for sure exactly what would happen. The Bible doesn't really record any previous knowledge from Moses. Maybe Moses picked up his stick and said, all right, here's my staff. What should I do? Should I make a snake again? God says, no. Forget the stupid snake. We're going to do something a little bit bigger here. What I'm about to show you is going to make the snake trick look like child's play, a cheap parlor trick compared to what I'm going to do here. You just watch and see. Hold it out over the sea, and I'll show you what I'm going to do. And so Moses holds out his staff. And it says, the Lord, in verse 21, drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. He sent a strong wind for sure. I guarantee it was more than just the wind. If God had sent enough wind just by the air pressure holding up the water, that people would be flying all over the place and they'd all be dead. Okay? Strictly supernatural, strictly miraculous. My guess, God split the water. He sends the wind to dry up the muck and the mud on the bottom so they can actually walk across. Turns into dry land super quick, probably like rock-hard cement after all those years of being compacted. They walk across on this newly paved road through the sea, compliments of God and his strong east wind. And the Israelites walked through on dry ground, all 2+ million of them. This was not a single file line, ladies and gentlemen. This is a massive crowd. 2+ million had to walk through the sea in one night. That's no small feat in itself. And so, sure enough, verse 23, the Egyptians then pursued them. God lifted his pillar, which had been separating them all night. He supernaturally did so. He allowed them to pursue. Again, I wonder what's going on in the minds of the Egyptians at this point. How gullible can you be? You just got beat up through 10 previous plagues. He's separated you on purpose so that you couldn't follow them. He split the sea supernaturally. Now he's luring you into the sea. You think any of those poor charioteers say, I'm not sure this is such a good idea. I mean, I respect my commander, but so far this God has proven pretty powerful, and I'm not sure that putting myself in the middle of the ocean with only this God holding up the water, and he clearly hates us because he's killing us off left and right, I'm not sure this is a great idea, but here we go. So they get down in the middle of the sea, and what happens? The end of verse 23, all Pharaoh's horses trained as horsemen, and in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the forces into a panic. It says, clogging their chariot wheels, or I have a note that says binding them up or removing them. I don't know exactly what happened to the chariot wheels, or they're falling off, they're seizing up, they're not spinning, but they're all getting stuck, they're in a panic and confusion. It's almost a tragically humorous scene down here. They're trying to chase the Israelites, but their wheels keep falling off. They have to stop and try to put their wheel back on, and the axles aren't spinning, and they're breaking out their oil cans and trying to grease up the axles quick so they can continue the pursuit or get out or do something, and it's mass chaos. Clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. And all of us look at the verse and say, duh. Hello, yes, that is correct. God is fighting against you. Verse 26, the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, and upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. All of the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians walked through a solid wall of water. Again, I'm just picturing the little 4- and 5-year-olds walking through the water, and they look at the water, and they start to poke in there, and one of them sees the little fish swimming around. They try to grab the fish. And Mommy says, Tommy, stop that. I'm not sure how solid that wall water is. We better keep moving. Don't catch the fish. It's not a good time for that right now. And they keep walking on. And they made it out through their pathway on dry ground. And God says to Moses, all right, hold out your staff. And the water, you can imagine the scene. The amount of hydraulic pressure forcing that water back together once God takes his hand away. Can you imagine? I don't know how deep it was, but it was enough to destroy the entire army. Not one survived. All the horses, all the chariots, all the people are the army. Can you imagine the roar of those two walls of waters? They come and just collapse together, smashing, obliterating anybody that's in the sea. And all the dead bodies start to float to the surface. And all these horses and all the charioteers, the whole army starts floating, and the dead bodies start washing up on the land. And the Israelites are looking at this and seeing this, looking at the complete and utter destruction and devastation that God has brought to the army. What was left of the army, by the way? How many of the original army were firstborn that were no longer even there that day? I don't know. So probably, quarter, third of their army is already gone because they died a couple days previous. Now what's left of their poor, bewildered army has now just been wiped out and destroyed. And Egypt now has no economy. They have no structure, very little livestock. They have no army. They are nothing. God has destroyed them and wiped them out single-handedly so that he could show the world who he was. And boy, didn't he do that in grand style. And for centuries to come, that's how God reminded his people. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt. Do not forget what I did to those people that day. That is who I am. That is my power. That's what I can do. And so he brings them up out of the sea, and he destroys the Egyptians. Let's see, where am I? Yes. Verse 30, thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians' dead bodies on the seashore. And Israel saw the great power that the Lord had used against the Egyptians, so that the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. And finally, these people who said, we don't even want to be rescued, just send us back to Egypt, now they finally what? Whew, they finally believe. It's taken a lot of effort on God's part to make them finally believe, but they believe. Sadly, that's going to be kind of short-lived, isn't it? But we will have to, we're going to have to address that in 2 weeks. Chapter 15, they actually sing a song about all this. I'm not going to read the song to you, but they sang a song of victory about how God destroyed the enemy and he wiped out the Egyptians, and he's taking them to their promised land, and off they go. And in chapter 15, verse 22, we start to see a different side of who God is. Now, God has just revealed himself as the all-powerful, the invincible warrior to his people, who kept his promise to get them out of the land of Egypt. And he has kind of reintroduced himself to the people. Remember, the people started out by saying, who is God? What's he like? What's his name? We don't even know who he is. Well, now they have some idea of who he is. Who is God at this point to them? We know a couple things from his reintroduction to his people. What do we know about God based on how he's just reintroduced himself to his people? He is what? Super powerful. He is the invincible warrior God. This God can defeat any other God, any other army, any other nation on planet Earth easily. I mean, he wipes them out. We've just seen him do it. So we've seen his power and invincibility and his strength. We also know that he, keeps his promises, because he promised that he would get us out of Egypt in 400 years. Sure enough, right on time, here we are. We waltzed right out of Egypt. Super easy. Nobody had to lift a sword. Nobody had to do anything other than go to your neighbors and say, give me money. And they said, okay. And they pack up and off they walk. No battle whatsoever on the people's part. So he is all-powerful, invincible, warrior. He's also a promise keeper who keeps his covenants and remembers his promises. In short, I guess we could say that he is what? What sounds like all-powerful, promise-keeping God? What does that sound like? I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. That is who I am. And now you know me by that name, don't you? Just like he said to Moses. But in verse 22 of chapter 15, he starts to show a different side of himself. He continues to reveal himself to his people. It's 9:44. We will not get to chapter 15, verse 22 today. But if you want to read ahead on your own, I will allow you to cheat. And you can read ahead if you want to in Exodus chapter 15. Next week there will be no Sunday school. We'll have we're not calling it cantata anymore, is it? The musical program next week, followed by the lunch in the FLC. And then in 2 weeks we will continue the book of Exodus. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you this morning. We see so much of who you are and how you behave through these stories. Help us never to get lost in the super fun stories about the plagues or the sea, because it's not about the plagues and the sea. It's about who you are and how you keep your promises and what you're like, how you behave towards your people and how you behave towards your enemies. Help us to know you better and who you are through these stories. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. You are dismissed.